So let us start with this idea that people keep saying to women over and over again. Just be yourself. It sounds innocent, right? Like, it's the kind of advice your best friend might give you before a date, or your mom might tell you before a job interview. On the surface, it feels empowering. It's basically saying, hey, you don't have to fake it. You don't have to change. Just show up as you are. And that feels comforting because the world already puts so much pressure on women to look a certain way, to act a certain way, to present themselves in this hyper-filtered, hyper-competitive environment. So of course, just be yourself sounds like relief. But here's the thing. For a lot of modern women, that advice is not just unhelpful, it's actually harmful. Because when someone says, be yourself, the unspoken assumption is that you already know who you are, that you're already grounded in your identity, that you have a stable sense of self. And the truth is, most people don't, especially in this world of endless social media, curated images, comparison, and hustle culture. Most of us are walking around with fragmented selves. Pieces of who we are shaped by Instagram influencers, by TikTok trends, by what we think men want, by what our parents expect, by what society rewards. So when you tell someone, just be yourself, what does that even mean? Which self are we talking about? The self that's trying to live up to the beauty standards on Instagram? The self that is exhausted from working twice as hard at her job just to be taken seriously? The self that is pretending she doesn't to care about a relationship because she doesn't want to look desperate? Or the self that is crying in bed at night because she feels like she is falling behind while everyone else is thriving? Be yourself assumes there's a clean, authentic version of you that's just waiting to be expressed. But for a lot of modern women, that self has been buried under layers of conditioning, trauma, comparison, and survival mechanisms. And so when they try to just be themselves, what actually happens is they show up as this anxious, insecure, half-formed identity that doesn't actually feel solid. And then when it doesn't work out, when the date ghosts them, when the job interview goes badly, when the social group doesn't accept them, they feel like even their true self isn't good enough. That's the trap. The advice sounds empowering, but it actually reinforces the shame. Because if you were yourself and it didn't work, the conclusion becomes, I must not be enough. My authentic self is unlovable, unworthy, inadequate. And once that belief sinks in, it drives women further into masking, into people-pleasing, into chasing external validation. So why is this especially damaging for modern women? Because modern culture has created an environment where women are constantly under a microscope. Think about it. Every outfit, every post, every choice you make is being compared, judged, and weighed against an impossible standard. Social media doesn't just show you what other people are doing. It creates an algorithm that literally pushes the most extreme versions of beauty. So imagine telling someone in that environment, just be yourself. It's like telling someone drowning in quicksand. Just relax. It completely ignores the reality of how fragmented and unstable people's identities have become. And let's talk about the psychological side of this. Developmentally, identity isn't something you're born with fully formed. It's something you construct over time through trial and error, through relationships, through feedback from the world. But what happens when the feedback you get is inconsistent, confusing, or downright toxic? What happens when you grow up with parents who reward you only when you achieve, or only when you look pretty, or only when you don't make waves? You don't develop an authentic self, you develop a performative one. Now fast forward into adulthood. You're walking into a dating scene that's hyper-competitive, where ghosting is normal, where hookup culture collides with people secretly wanting real intimacy, where apps turn human connection into swiping. How do you be yourself in that? If your authentic self is anxious about rejection, or scared of abandonment, or unsure of what she really wants, that authenticity will get you chewed up in a system designed to reward confidence, detachment, and instant gratification. Or let's look at the professional world. Women are told, just be yourself at work. But what does that mean in a corporate culture that was built by and for men? If yourself is someone who values collaboration, empathy, or vulnerability, how do those traits get interpreted? Often as weakness. You get labeled too soft or not leadership material, so you learn to mask. You learn to be assertive without being too aggressive. You learn to smile when you're angry, to stay quiet when you're overlooked, to work twice as hard for half the recognition. And then someone comes along and says, just be yourself. What they don't realize is you've spent years being punished for being yourself. So, this is where the advice breaks down. It assumes that authenticity is easy. But authenticity is a skill. It's something you cultivate. It's not just about expressing whatever raw emotion or impulse you feel. It is about knowing yourself well enough to decide which parts of you to bring forward in a given moment. And that requires a level of self-awareness and self-compassion that most people were never taught. This is why women feel lost. Because the world keeps giving them slogans instead of tools. Be yourself. Love yourself. You're enough. These phrases sound empowering, but they don't actually tell you how to untangle the mess of conditioning, shame, and trauma that's hiding your authentic self. So women end up feeling like failures for not being able to live up to advice that was empty to begin with. And here's the deeper danger. Be yourself becomes an excuse for stagnation. Because if you're supposed to be yourself, then why work on yourself? Why grow? Why confront the parts of you that are insecure or avoidant or codependent? Why question the narratives you've internalized about your worth or your relationships? It's almost like a subtle trap that keeps women from evolving because they confuse authenticity with staying the same. But real authenticity isn't about staying the same. It's about becoming more whole. Now, I'm not saying women should abandon themselves or fake their way through life. The point isn't to reject authenticity. The point is to understand that authenticity is not a starting point, it's an endpoint. It's the result of doing the hard work of self-exploration, healing, and integration. And until you've done that work, just be yourself is like telling someone with a broken compass to just keep walking straight. That's why, in my experience working with women, the ones who thrive aren't the ones who cling to slogans. They're the ones who are willing to do the messy, uncomfortable work of asking, who am I really? What parts of me are authentic and what parts are just survival strategies? Where did I learn to perform, to please, to shrink myself? What do I actually want, apart from what society tells me to want? And until you start answering those questions, just be yourself will keep leading you into disappointment because the self you're bringing forward isn't whole. It's fragmented. The really tricky thing about being yourself is that people assume the self is fixed. Like it's this one authentic version of you that's sitting under the surface and all you need to do is let it shine. But the truth is, the self is fluid. It's constantly shifting, constantly evolving depending on your experiences, your environment, and your stage of life. And that means that what feels authentic at 20 might not feel authentic at 30. The way you express yourself in front of friends might be totally different than how you express yourself in front of your parents. So when someone says, just be yourself, it ignores the reality that the self is not a static thing. It's more like a river, constantly flowing and taking shape depending on the landscape it's moving through. And for women especially, that landscape has been historically shaped by forces that don't prioritize their wholeness. Think about how girls are socialized from a young age. They're told to be nice, to smile, to be helpful, to not make people uncomfortable. At the same time, they're told to excel, to compete, to be ambitious, but not so ambitious that they intimidate men. That contradiction gets baked into their nervous systems from childhood. So by the time they're adults, being yourself is already tangled up in conflicting messages about what kind of self is acceptable. You see this a lot in relationships. Women are told, just be yourself, and the right guy will love you. But then when they show up as themselves, with needs, with insecurities, with boundaries, sometimes the reaction is rejection. Maybe the guy calls her too much or needy or crazy. Maybe he pulls away when she expresses vulnerability. And then she's left thinking, wait, if I was myself and I still got rejected, maybe there's something wrong with me. That's how authenticity turns into shame. So what do women do? They start to adjust. They learn to hide their real needs because they're afraid of scaring people off. They laugh at jokes they don't find funny. They act more chill than they feel. They dress in ways that fit the vibe rather than expressing what they truly like. They become masters at curating themselves, at reading the room and adapting to what's expected. And ironically, that curation often gets rewarded. The more they fit into the mold, the more validation they get, which reinforces the idea that the authentic self is a liability. This is where the cheap dopamine of external validation becomes such a trap. Because every compliment, every swipe, right, gives you a little hit that says, yes, this curated version of you is working. But deep down, you start to feel this emptiness. Because you know that the version of you that is being validated, I enter into the full you. It's just the mask. And after enough time, you start to wonder if anyone will ever actually love the real you. Now, here's the really cruel twist. A lot of women have internalized this so deeply that when they finally do try to show up authentically, they don't even know if what they're re-expressing is real or just another layer of performance. That's what happens when you've spent years pleasing, performing, adapting. You lose touch with your own internal signals. You don't know if you actually want something or if you've just been conditioned to think you should want it. You don't know if you actually like the person you're dating or if you just like the fact that they like you. You don't know if you want the career you're in or if you're just chasing the prestige because that's what everyone around you values. So when someone says, just be yourself, you're left with this confusion. Which self? The one that's been conditioned? The one that's performing? The one that's angry and suppressed? Or the one that you haven't even met yet because you've never had the space to discover her? That is why be yourself, isn't just bad advice. It is incomplete. It skips over the most important step, discovering who you actually are. And that process is not easy. It involves questioning the narratives you've been fed. It involves looking at the ways you've been performing and asking why. It involves noticing the patterns in your relationships, the places where you keep abandoning yourself for approval, the ways you silence your own voice out of fear of being rejected. And let me be real with you, this process is uncomfortable. Because when you peel back the layers of performance, what you find isn't always pretty. Sometimes you find resentment that you've been carrying for years. Sometimes you find grief over all the times you betrayed yourself. Sometimes you find anger at your parents, at society, at the men who dismissed you, at the women who judged you. Sometimes you find fear that if you stop performing, no one will stay. That's why most people don't actually want authenticity. They want the fantasy of authenticity, the shiny version that looks empowering on Instagram quotes, but doesn't require them to actually confront their pain. But the real road to being yourself is paved with uncomfortable truths, and that's why slogans don't work, because you can't shortcut your way to wholeness. Now, I want to address something really important here. A lot of women are starting to wake up to these patterns, and that's a good thing. But sometimes the pendulum swings too far in the other direction. Instead of people-pleasing, they start saying, I don't care what anyone thinks. I'm just going to do me. And while that sounds liberating, sometimes it's just another mask. Because if your authenticity is rooted in rebellion and proving to the world that you don't need anyone, that's not actually wholeness either. That's just another performance, driven by pain. So the real work isn't about swinging between extremes, between pleasing and rebelling, between shrinking and overcompensating. It's about integrating. It's about being able to hold your softness and your strength at the same time. It's about being able to say, yes, I want love, and that doesn't make me weak. It's about being able to express ambition without apologizing, vulnerability without shame, boundaries without guilt. And here's the truth most people don't want to admit. Authenticity costs something. It costs relationships. It costs jobs. It costs comfort. Because when you start showing up as your whole self, not everyone will like it. Not everyone will stick around. Not every environment will welcome you. And that's why be yourself is such a dangerous half-truth. It doesn't prepare women for the reality that authenticity requires courage, resilience, and the willingness to lose what doesn't align. But here's the paradox. As scary as that is, it's also the only path to real fulfillment. Because the alternative is to keep performing, to keep pleasing, to keep building a life that looks good on the outside but feels hollow on the inside. And no amount of likes, swipes, promotions, or compliments will ever fill that void. Only living in alignment with your true self will. And let me be clear, finding that true self isn't about rejecting femininity or rejecting masculinity or rejecting society altogether. It's about discovering what feels authentic to you, not what you've been told is acceptable. Maybe for you that means being a career-driven powerhouse. Maybe it means being a nurturing mother. Maybe it means being both. Maybe it means something entirely outside the box. The point isn't which path you choose. The point is that you're choosing from a place of authenticity instead of conditioning. That's why the advice should never just be yourself. It should be do the work to find yourself. Do the work to heal the parts of you that have been silenced. Do the work to separate your real desires from the ones society planted in you. And then, once you've done that work, bring that version of yourself into the world unapologetically. Because only then does being yourself actually mean something. One of the biggest traps I see with modern women trying to be themselves is that they constantly trying to balance who they really are with who the world rewards. And those two things don't always line up. Imagine a woman who's naturally sensitive, empathetic, deeply intuitive. Those qualities are strengths. They make her a great friend, partner, leader, healer. But in a dating world that rewards aloofness and low investment energy, sensitivity gets labeled as clingy. In a corporate world that rewards cutthroat competition, empathy gets dismissed as weak. So she learns to suppress those traits. She hardens herself in relationships. She tones down her intuition in meetings. And every time she does, she's rewarded. She gets fewer rejections, more promotions, but at the cost of losing herself piece by piece. And then someone tells her, just be yourself. Do you see how cruel that sounds? Because the truth is, every time she's been herself, she's been punished. So her nervous system now associates authenticity with danger. That's why she gets anxious before dates. That's why she feels imposter syndrome at work. That's why she struggles to relax even around friends. Her body has learned that showing up authentically leads to rejection, judgment, or exclusion. And this is where the advice really starts to backfire, because if being yourself feels unsafe, what do? You either keep performing or you withdraw completely. Some women stay stuck in the performance loop, constantly curating, constantly adapting, constantly burning themselves out trying to be liked. Others swing to the opposite extreme, isolating, saying, I don't need anyone, building walls so high that no one can get in. Both of these are survival strategies. Neither of them lead to fulfillment.